So now we're going to take a look at the sounds that we hear and some of the sounds that we don't hear. So it turns out we hear a limited range of frequencies and volume. So when we think about the sounds that we hear, it's always going to be a combination of the frequency and the volume. And so on this graph, we can see here on the bottom on the x-axis, we have a frequency, right? So low to high corresponding from low pitch to high pitch. So the left side of the piano versus the right side of the piano keys, right? On the y-axis here, we have the volume from low to high. So yeah, decibels, right? And so notice the blue blob here in the middle. That corresponds to what we can hear. And so if we look at this carefully, we can see that some frequencies of sound, right here around 2000, we can hear even when they're at a really, really low volume. But other frequencies of sound that are much lower, closer here to a hertz of say 20, have to be really loud, pretty loud here before we'll even hear them at all. So a 20 hertz sound, so a very low sound, has to be turned up to a really high volume before we'll hear it. But a more mid-frequency, kind of in the middle range here of our frequencies, so sound in this sort of middle range can be heard even at a very, very, very low volume. And then here we can see that speech, conveniently enough, corresponds to a range of frequencies that we can generally hear really well, even when people are speaking very, very quietly, very, kind of whispering. So we'll hear speech sound really, really well. But like a really low frequency sound, like what you might hear coming out of a subwoofer, we tend to not hear too well, and those have to be turned up much louder before we'll ever hear them. So that's one important characteristic of sound, is that we don't hear all frequencies, that it's always going to be a combination of that frequency at a certain volume is what we will hear. So, for example, 2000 hertz frequency will be heard at a 10 decibel volume, but a 200 hertz frequency has to get turned up to, maybe closer to 20 decibel volume. Another important aspect of sound is that real sounds found in nature, so a bird chirping and musical instruments and human voices, are always going to be a combination of frequencies, never just one frequency. So here we have a person playing the flute, and they're playing a particular, note on the flute, and notice that they are creating not one frequency, but a number of different frequencies. But notice how they're spaced apart evenly. That's what makes it sound good. That's what creates the note. So here we have a flute, here we have a violin, and again, notice they're creating a number of different frequencies, not just one. So we're going to learn about how a particular pitch or, a musical note is created, and we're going to learn about how the pitch of the sound that we hear is determined by the absolute lowest frequency heard here. We call it the fundamental frequency. So here in the case of the violin's lowest set of frequencies is at 392 hertz, and then it's creating a series of other frequencies that are all multiples of 392. So we're just sort of, 392 times 2 times 3 times 4, and that's what we're seeing here in these other frequencies that are created when the person plays that particular note in the violin. But that lowest fundamental frequency is the one that determines the note that she's playing. So that low frequency, lowest fundamental frequency, is really important. It is critical in sort of shaping our perception of the sound. And so just to create an example with very simple numbers, imagine that there's a sound that has a really low 400 hertz tone, and it has then the multiples of 800, 1200, and 1600. The lowest one is the fundamental, and then the multiples, the 800, the 1200, the 1600, are called harmonics. So the fundamental is the lowest, and then the other ones that are multiples of it are the harmonics. And removing the fundamental frequency or other lower frequencies changes what's called the timbre, the quality of the sound, but not the actual pitch of the sound. So let's take a look at that. we're able to perceive the pitch even if the fundamental frequency is missing. Our brains basically fill it in and will infer it. So if the 400 is missing, and we're hearing just the 800, the 1200, and the 1600, and the 2000 or whatever, well, turns out that our brains will deduce that, 400 would be the fundamental, and it assigns that same value to our experience of the pitch, whether or not that 400 is actually there. This comes in very handy when we're speaking on a phone. Phones cannot reproduce most fundamental frequencies. They're kind of low, and so the little tiny speaker on a phone can't really reproduce that, but we can usually identify the person calling us by their familiar voice. We don't have to hear the fundamental frequency. We can detect the pitch of their voice just fine, and we call that periodicity pitch. We are inferring the pitch through the harmonics. Now, like we saw earlier, we don't hear all frequencies equally well. Some sounds we're definitely more sensitive to than others. And we can see this in what's called an audibility curve. And so, once again, we're going to look at this graph. Frequency is down here on the X, low to high. Volume, shown here in decibel, is shown, again, also from low to high on the vertical. So volume on the vertical, pitch here on the bottom, on the X. So let's take a look at these two sounds, sound A and sound B. Now remember, every sound is a combination of both pitch and volume, right? So, sound A, what is the frequency or the pitch? It's a very low pitched tone, right? It has a very low frequency. You know, maybe 30 might be the frequency, just to kind of estimate it. This sound, if it's turned up to 40 decibels, we won't hear it. I know this because this green line is the threshold of hearing. Anything above the green, a person with normal hearing will detect. But anything below the green, a person with normal hearing will not be able to detect, not be able to hear it. And so this sound here, say 30 hertz sound at 40 decibels, will be outside of our range of hearing. We won't hear that sound. In contrast, sound B, which is a higher frequency, now we're looking at a 100 hertz sound, so a little higher frequency sound. If we play it at 40 decibels volume, guess what? People do hear it. And so that demonstrates that we are more sensitive to sounds that are more in the middle of our range of hearing than the ones that are super, super low, or also over here on the right, the ones that are super, super high frequency. So the middle ranges, the middle frequencies are the ones that we hear really, really, really well. A 500 hertz sound we will hear at a even lower volume, right? So that one only has to be at 5 decibels to be able to hear it. Whereas the 100 hertz sound has to be turned up to 40 decibels, right? So yeah, so the sounds that we're most sensitive to, we can hear even when they are at very, very low volume. Other sounds we have to turn up the volume much higher before we will hear them.